Good evening, everybody. We'll kick off right on the mark tonight. Thank you for joining us. At the moment, the ANU rule is to wear a mask when you're indoors. Speakers exempted. I appreciate you may not all know that because you're punters from the outside world, that big amazing thing outside the boundaries. But if you got them, light them up. Welcome to tonight's War Studies seminar. I forgot to check the number for tonight. We are approaching 50 War Studies seminars. I'm not sure if you're actually number 50, but anyway, we're approaching the half-century mark. So thank you for joining us. It's the first one for a little while. A bit of seminar interruptus earlier this year. Please turn your phones down or off before we start. As I said, if you've got a mask, please put it on. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Christine Helliwell to speak to us tonight about her book, well, topics related to her book about the Second World War in Borneo. Christine is an anthropologist in the College of Social Science, Arts and Social Sciences here at the ANU, and got interested in Borneo in the Second World War, so worked in Borneo for many, many years. Got interested in Borneo in the Second World War and ended up writing a history book, which she's done exceedingly well because she was just announced as the runner-up in this year's prestigious Templar Prize or Templar Medal in Britain. So she's doing well out of the blocks. And please join me in thanking her for joining us tonight.
On 25 March 1945, two Australian aircraft arrived over the remote Kellup Plateau in the mountainous centre of the island of Borneo. And for those of you who don't know where Borneo is, it's located not far to the east of Singapore, in fact, not too far northwest of Australia. And I've circled it in red for people who don't know where it is. These two aircraft contained, apart from their aircrew, 8 Allied soldiers, mostly Australian, as the vanguard of a secret Australian operation. This was the opening stanza to Operation Semut, the Australian World War II special operation that I'm going to talk about tonight. Okay, so this seminar paper is organised into 3 parts. Firstly, I'm going to give you a brief overview of Operation Semut. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what I believe to be the most important point to have come out of the research that I did for this book, and that is the key role played in the operation by Borneo's Indigenous Dayak people. You need to know something about this before I move on to the third part of the seminar. And then in the third part, I'll talk about another key discovery that I made during the research, and that is the British influence over this ostensibly Australian operation and the repercussions of that influence. So let me start by giving you an overview of Operation Semut. Operation Semut was a secret Australian military operation that took place on the island of Borneo in 1945, in the final months of World War II. Immediately prior to World War II, Borneo had been politically divided into a northern British domain and a much larger southern Dutch domain. The northern British section of the island included the Protectorate of Sarawak in the west, ruled by the Brooke family, a British family. Some of you may have know of the Brooke families because they were known as the famous White Rajas of Sarawak. And you can see Sarawak just up here in the northwest of the island. On the north coast in the British section was the tiny Sultanate of Brunei, ruled by its Malay Raja. And those two little dark splodges there are Brunei. And in the east, still in the British section, was the British North Borneo, administered by the British North Borneo Chartered Company. And you can see it, this area just up here. Today, Sarawak and what was then British North Borneo are both states of Malaysia, Sarawak and Sabah, respectively. Brunei today remains an independent sultanate. Dutch Borneo, of course, is today Kalimantan, one piece of the cornucopia of islands that together make up Indonesia. Okay, so this map shows how Borneo looked immediately prior to World War II. Then World War II came along, and Borneo was occupied by the Japanese in late 1941, early 1942, immediately before they took Singapore. However, by late 1944, With the war in the Pacific turning decisively in favour of the Allies had begun formulating plans to invade Borneo and win it back from the Japanese. The Allied landings at Labuan on the north coast of Borneo were planned to take place sometime in 1945. And Labuan Island, you can see just there, so the landings were going to take place right there. And as part of this planning, the Allies decided to secretly insert groups of commandos, mostly Australian, into the interior of Sarawak in advance of the invasion. The commandos were from the organisation called Special Operations Australia, codenamed Services Reconnaissance Department, and popularly known today as said Special Unit. They were asked to provide intelligence that could be used to help plan the Australian invasion. They were also tasked with recruiting locals, especially the island's jungle-dwelling Indigenous Dayak peoples, to fight the Japanese. The story of this operation is a truly remarkable one. The first groups of operatives were dropped by parachute directly into the island's rugged inland mountainous jungles. And I've marked with a red circle on the map there, the area where the first groups of commandos were dropped. Most of them were very young Australians, and many of them had never been out Australia before, let alone experienced jungles like those that then covered the island. Most of them spoke no Indigenous Dayak languages, and indeed, few of them had ever met Indigenous or Asian people before. And yet it was crucial that the operatives win the trust and support of the island's Dayak peoples if the operation was to be in any way successful. To make matters worse, the operatives knew that Diaxs throughout Borneo had once been, and perhaps still were, headhunters. They were jumping into areas which had been largely beyond the reach of the pre-war European colonial administrations. And of course, the European administrations had banned headhunting, so they were jumping outside of these areas. It was also possible that the Japanese had reached these remote inland areas and established bases there. If that was the case, the operatives could well parachute directly down into enemy camps. As one of the veterans of the operation told me when I interviewed him 70 years later, he said, and I quote, "It was like the frying pan in the fire. If the Japanese didn't get you, the Diaxs might," end of quote. Now, on the Indigenous Dayak side, some of the Dayaks in these areas had never before seen a white face, had never seen aeroplanes, had never seen parachutes. And by the way, this is a photograph that was taken during Operation Semut. Others were unhappy about the previous European colonial administrations, which had ruled most of the island before the Japanese came. And they were unhappy in part because of the way in which the colonial administrators had so precipitously fled when the Japanese had arrived. So Dayak support for the operation, or even a friendly reception from Dayak peoples, was by no means a certainty. In fact, the Semut operatives who went into Borneo were lucky. Many Dayak groups decided, after often lengthy periods of negotiation, to throw in their lot with Semut. And they went on to fight a guerrilla war against the Japanese through the jungles and along the rivers of northern Borneo, steadily pushing the Japanese down those rivers towards the coast. It really is a remarkable story. And I'm not trying to sell my book, it really is a remarkable story. While the operation started out as a single party, it quickly split into three parties, each with its own separate command: Semut 1, Semut 2, and Semut 3. So Semut 1 operated throughout far eastern Sarawak and in neighbouring parts of British North Borneo, in this area here, down, in fact, as far as the coast. They operated through there. Semut 2 operated along the Baram River and surrounding areas, this area here. And Semut 3 operated in this huge area right along the mighty Rajang River, this river that you can see here. And they operated right along the mighty Rajang River up here to the coast and down over the border into what is now Kalimantan. So they operated in this very large area here. So between them, these three sub-operations covered a huge territory. A fourth party, Semut 4, was added much later, in August 1945. It was mostly concerned with end-of-war mopping up activities on Sarawak's north coast. So when we think and talk about Operation Semut, we're mostly concerned with Semut 1, 2, and 3. And it's those three parts of the operation that I'll be talking about today. Okay, so that's a little bit of background about the operation. Let me go on now to talk about the critical Dayak role within this operation. Many scholars have pointed out that official records and histories of World War II's war in the Pacific tend to overlook the role played by local peoples. This is hardly a new point that I'm making. Nevertheless, I was astonished at the degree of invisibility of local people, including Diaxs, that I encountered when I first began reading official reports and documents relating to Operation Semut. Local people are barely mentioned there. This is in spite of the fact that many more Diaxs than white operatives served on the operation, and many more Diaxs than white operatives died on the operation. When I first interviewed the three remaining Semut veterans, all of whom have since died, between 2014 and 2016, all of them emphasized the same point over and over. Without the Diaxs, we were nothing, said one of them. Without the Diaxs, we wouldn't have lasted a day, said another. And almost every personal account that I read by Semut operatives made exactly the same point. Diaxs were critical to this campaign. And some of those accounts provide a great deal of detail about the Dayak contribution. And this accorded with what Diaxs themselves told me when I interviewed them in 2015 and 2018 throughout the areas of Sarawak and Sabah where the operation had taken place. And I trekked for months through both of those states, trying to find people who could still remember the war and particularly could still remember Operation Semut. Now, I should be careful to note here that other Borneo locals also took part in the operation, including Malays, Chinese, Eurasians. But Operation Semut was planned from the start to seek recruits primarily from Dayak groups. As a result, most of the local support for the operation came from Dayaks. Most Semut operatives were anxious in 1945 when asked whether they would be prepared to go to Borneo, as many of them later wrote or said. They felt this anxiety in part because the name Borneo itself had for centuries conjured up fearful images in the popular Western imagination. Images of dark, fetid jungles full of head-hunting savages, something like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And I remember as a child being told that if I was naughty, the wild man of Borneo would get me. And of course, this was a very frightening thing to be told. Nevertheless, the operatives put aside their fears. They were all extraordinarily brave men, and they went. For many of them, accustomed as they were to more arid, more domesticated environments, the jungles turned out to be even worse than imagined. Their time in them marked by an unrelenting sense of terror and threat, and I write about this at some length in the book. This jungle fever, as they came to call it, was intensified by the fact that the jungles potentially harbored Japanese, spectral companions on every jungle journey. And many Semut veterans had nightmares for years afterwards about the jungles, as both they and their families told me. Crucially, however, and this is the point that I want to emphasize here, in this alien threat-filled world, the Diaxs were not at all as the operatives had expected. Before arriving in Borneo, most operatives were subject to the prejudices and fears about Asian and Indigenous peoples common among Europeans at the time. This was, after all, a time when the White Australia policy was still in place. But when they arrived in Borneo, rather than the savage headhunters that they'd expected, the operatives found dignified peoples who took them in and treated them with astounding generosity. It cannot have been easy for Dayak communities to decide that they would host and help the operatives. For a start, the operatives were a heavy drain on scarce resources, including not just food, but also manpower lost to the operation. They were recruiting men to come and fight and work for the operation, and all of these men are lost to people who are basically subsistence cultivators. In addition, Diaxs were subject to the daily demands of looking after a horde of strangers who were completely at sea in this environment. Not to mention the terrible repercussions of providing such assistance if any word of it should reach the Japanese not too much further downriver. Nevertheless, for a range of reasons which I discuss in the book, many Diaxs did decide to join the operation. And this slide, which I absolutely love, this is a wonderful slide. Unfortunately, you can't really see it very well on the screen, but it actually shows a canoe full of Kenya Dayak people coming down the Baram River. These are Semut guerrillas, Kenya guerrillas, and they're flying the Union Jack at the stern of the boat. It's important to recognize that in joining the operation, Diaxs didn't simply provide support for the operatives. Diaxs, in fact, assumed leading combat roles in the operation. Diaxs had lived in these jungles all their lives and fought their own intertribal wars in them. Dayak warfare has seldom taken the form of conventional Western warfare, in which armies faced off against one another in open displays of military might. That kind of warfare is obviously useless in the close confines of a Borneo jungle. Instead, Dayak jungle warfare has always relied on the kinds of techniques usually associated with unconventional Western warfare. In other words, the techniques associated with special operations like Semut. Stealth, guile, trickery, luring the enemy into a false sense of security, effecting sudden unexpected raids or ambushes. These were all central components of Dayak warfare, which were used to lethal effect during Operation Semut. Put together with the Dayak ability to move soundlessly and unseen through the jungle, as well as their skill with blowpipe and sword, Dayaks were unparalleled as combatants in this kind of warfare. And here's another wonderful slide taken from Operation Semut, showing an Iban Dayak man with his Lee Enfield rifle, which he's been issued by Semut over his back, but much more importantly, his huge parang, his Dayak sword in his hand. In addition, Dayaks understood the weather, the terrain, the movements of the rivers, the local flora and fauna, knowledge that was critical to tactical and strategic planning. The operatives had none of this necessary local knowledge. As a result, Dayaks assumed a role at the very heart of operation planning. The operatives brought their own particular sets of knowledges and skills to the operation, and without those, the operation could not have got off the ground. But it also could not have got off the ground without the skills, knowledge, and labor of its Dayak participants. To ignore this Dayak contribution not only fails to give credit where credit is due, which is bad enough, it also makes a mockery of what is surely a basic tenet of special forces philosophy. That is, the critical need to cultivate local support if an operation is to have any chance of success. Even in those early days of special forces warfare, when such warfare was still in its infancy, as it was during World War II, the planners of Operation Semut had understood this tenet and had planned the operation with it in mind. Operation Semut was successful to the degree that it was, precisely because of the improbable partnerships that its mostly Australian personnel were able to form with local Dayak peoples. And in this slide, you've got you can see a local Iban leader, Balaja Ana Ankin, on the left, with Lieutenant Rowan Waddy of Semut on the right. And they formed what they called a blood brotherhood relationship. This brings me to the third part of my seminar. And here I want to focus on the British role in Operation Semut, something that's been mentioned in no other detailed account of the operation, but in fact, which is very important if you are to understand this operation. Now, as I've already said, Operation Semut was mounted by an organisation called Special Operations Australia, or SOA. While SOA was an Australian organisation, part of the Australian Army, it was in fact heavily controlled by the British. The top positions in SOA were mostly held by British officers who had been seconded from the British Special Operations Organisation called Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Similarly, many SOA officers in the field, those who actually led operations on the ground, were British. This British involvement is very evident with respect to Operation Semut. The three men who were most centrally involved in planning the operation, Lieutenant Colonel Jack Finlay, Lieutenant Colonel G.B. Courtney, and Captain George Crowther, were all British, all seconded from SOE, as were most of the additional men who moved in and out of the planning group over the months that it met, because the planning group sort of people came in and they moved out as they went off on operations. But those three men were the core of the group. In addition, of the Operations 3 field commanding officers, two of them, Major Tom Harrison in command of Semut 1 and Major Bill Soshin in command of Semut 3, were British, both seconded from SOE. The third field commander, Major Toby Carter of Semut 2, was a New Zealander who had originally enlisted in the AIF. However, and this makes the point more clearly than almost anything else, I think, Carter was required to join the British Army and from there SOE before he could take over as the original commanding officer of Operation Semut. He was originally the commanding officer of the entire operation before it separated into Semut 1, 2, and 3. Similarly, of their 3 seconds in command, 2 were British and the third again was a New Zealander who had enlisted with the AIF. So of the 6 field commanding officers and seconds in command, 5 were from the British Army SOE and 1 was from the AIF SOA. It's a pretty heavy imbalance. For these British officers, SOA was, in the words of Tom Harrison, the commanding officer of Semut 1, and I quote, a branch of SOE. This was how Harrison described SOA after the war, as a branch of SOE. And in British documents, SOA is very often referred to as SOE, which I found incredibly confusing when I was first researching this operation. This heavy British involvement in SOA meant that the organisation was to a very significant degree under the sway of the British government, and especially in the case of Borneo, under the sway of the British Colonial Office. The British were very keen to recapture their pre-war Borneo territories, in part because of the oil fields and other economic assets that were located there. And their sense of urgency over this was exacerbated by several other factors. Firstly, they had intelligence warning of possible independence movements in their Borneo territories, especially in British North Borneo. And these concerns about possible independence movements were linked to their conviction that they, the British, had suffered a catastrophic loss of face in the eyes of local Borneo peoples as a result of the ease with which the Japanese had pushed them out of the island. Secondly, the British were worried about possible US influence in Borneo. The Americans were hostile to British colonial endeavours in Southeast Asia, and the British were concerned about the possible effects of this on local populations. And some British, thirdly, were also worried about possible Australian designs on Borneo. Graham Sligo, among others, has written about this in his excellent book, The Backroom Boys. As a result, the British were very keen to establish a presence in Borneo before the end of the war. The idea was that this presence would bolster the standing of the British in the eyes of local people and begin to pave the way for a return to British rule as soon as the Japanese had surrendered. However, the British were hampered in this objective by the unfortunate fact that Borneo fell within the American-led Southwest Pacific Area Command, rather than the British-led Southeast Asia Command over on mainland Southeast Asia. In other words, the Americans had control over most of the Pacific area, including Borneo, and it was the Americans who called the shots there with regard to any military activity. This meant that the British had no choice but to pursue their objective of establishing a presence in Borneo less directly. That is, via the back door provided by British control over SOA. A letter from the British Secretary of State for the Colonies to the Prime Minister Winston Churchill in March 1945 sets out this backdoor route quite clearly. And I'll give you a moment to read it. I think you can still see it in spite of that. It's that last 4 or 5 lines that's particularly interesting there. The 2 SOA operations planned to take place in Borneo in 1945, Operation Argas in British North Borneo and Operation Semut in Sarawak, were planned with exactly this British objective in mind. They were both intended to establish a British presence there that would show the flag and pave the way for a return to British rule once the war was over. However, there was a problem. The Americans, who controlled what took place in Borneo, were hostile to any British, what they saw as political activities of this type. The Americans didn't like these sort of colonial British activities. So SOA needed to keep this political objective secret from the American Southwest Pacific Area Command. As a result, on the surface, Operation Semut's main objective, as an ostensibly Australian operation, was to help prepare the way for the Australian 9th Division invasion at Labuan. This was the overall objective set out in the formal proposal for the operation that was submitted by SOA to the Americans at General Headquarters in November 1944. However, its second secret objective, equally as important, but not set out anywhere in the formal proposal, was to boost British prestige and pave the way for the immediate return of British rule in Sarawak once the Japanese had been defeated, as it was now looking as if they were going to be. And even though this wasn't stated in any of the official proposals or planning documents, it is made clear in several of the later official reports, as well as in some of the personal accounts by the operations planners and leaders written after the war. And just to give you some idea of the duplicity involved here, let me show you a quote taken from a note sent by an SOE officer to the head of SOE at the time. The note itself refers specifically to Operation Argas, mounted in British North Borneo at almost the same time as Operation Semut was mounted across the border in Sarawak. But all the evidence points to exactly the same level of duplicity occurring with reference to Operation Semut. And I'll give you a moment to read that one. It's a very interesting quote. Tom Harrison, commanding officer of Semut 1, tells us that at his SOE Operation Semut recruitment interview in London in 1944, he was told that the British needed to find men to take part in a special operation in Borneo in order to, quote, save some of the face lost to the Japanese. Similarly, Lieutenant Colonel G.V. Courtney, a British military officer on secondment from SOE, who was the overall controller of SOA's Borneo operations, wrote after the war that the Borneo operations had allowed SOA, quote, to contribute effectively to the restoration of British rule in its Asian colonies and of its lost political influence in the Far East. So in other words, the Semut parties were as concerned with the complexion of the post-war peace in Borneo as they were with winning the war itself. And I'm no expert on special operations, I'm a simple anthropologist, but I suspect that this concern with the post-war peace is very often a central feature of special operations. Now, this concern with the post-war peace had important consequences for what Semut operatives did once they entered Borneo. In particular, they worked hard to foster relationships with local peoples and re-establish trust in the British and in British rule, to such a degree that these efforts are frequently set out in operational reports. They wooed Dayak support for the operation by promising that an Allied invasion was imminent, and that once the invasion had taken place, Allied soldiers would protect Dayak communities from the Japanese until Sarawak was returned to British rule. Australian regular forces would move inland, they said, clearing the country of remaining Japanese and readying it for the return of the British. And secure in this understanding, local guerrilla armies working with Semut began to attack Japanese bases throughout the Semut areas, pushing the Japanese down the rivers back towards the coast. However, and this is a big however, the 9th Australian Division, which began its landings at Labuan and Brunei Bay on 10th of June 1945, had never signed up to this British plan. And its objectives with respect to the Borneo campaign were rather different. With the end of the war in sight, the commanding officer of 9th Division, Major General George Wooten, was under extreme pressure from the Australian government to minimise Australian casualties in Borneo and get in and out of the island as quickly as possible. The Australian government regarded Borneo as something of a sideshow, likely to be of little political or economic benefit once the war was over. This was especially the message coming from the Australian government after Ben Chifley took over as Australian Prime Minister on 13 July 1945, following the death of John Curtin. So Chifley took over only 4 or so weeks after the Labuan landings. Chifley was clear that there should be no waste of time and manpower in Borneo. As a result, Wooten's overall objectives for Sarawak were minimal. 9th Division would take and control the narrow northern coastal strip of the territory where the vast majority of Japanese were located. So Wooten's plan was simply that they were going to just take the strip down here, only a few kilometres in from the coast, take and hold that strip there. And also, of course, take the main city of Kuching and surrounding areas, but that was it. Wooten had no intention of extending Australian control beyond that. Any Japanese forces outside of the narrow coastal strip, which was where most Japanese were located, by the way, most of them were on that narrow coastal strip. Any Japanese forces outside of the narrow coastal strip would be left largely to their own devices until such time as the British were able to re-establish colonial order. In other words, Wooten's eyes were fixed firmly on winning the war itself. As he saw it, the post-war peace, beyond the immediate post-surrender period of military government, was not his concern. Now, these conflicting objectives provided an immediate and obvious basis for conflict between the unconventional force of SOA Operation Semut on the one hand, and the conventional force of 9th Division on the other. The situation was made worse by the deep mutual suspicion that already existed between the two forces. It seems that many of the conventional soldiers of 9th Division regarded the unconventional soldiers of Semut, and probably regarded all Special Forces soldiers, as prima donnas, whose efforts were largely ineffectual when it came to fighting an enemy and winning a war. And you can see this in lots of documents from the time. On the other hand, for their part, many in SOA appeared to feel contempt for 9th Division, whose personnel they saw as holding a less sophisticated understanding of Borneo and its people, and of what should be done for them, than did the personnel of SOA. Now, added to these inflammatory stereotypes, because stereotypes is what they are, was the problem of SOA headquarters' obsession with secrecy, which meant that it often failed to pass on information to 9th Division about the whereabouts of Semut operatives. So 9th Division soldiers were often unaware of the presence of Semut personnel until they stumbled across them by accident, often while scouting for enemy soldiers. And this, not surprisingly, led to considerable conflict on the ground. The tensions were exacerbated still further by the fact that almost all of those in 9th Division, including those in senior command positions, were Australian. By contrast, most of the senior command positions in Operation Semut and in SOA more broadly, as we've seen, were British. It's worth noting in this regard that in 9th Division's order of battle for the Labuan landings, SOA parties in the area, including Operation Semut, were described as, quote, British units, suggesting that 9th Division was aware of British control over SOA. To complicate matters even further, all of this was taking place in the context of growing tensions between the Australians and the British over the character and role of the newly established British Borneo Civil Affairs Unit, whose job it was to take over government and administration of areas of British Borneo once they were recovered from the enemy. And these tensions gave rise to all kinds of disputes on the ground in Borneo between the Australian 9th Division on the one hand and the British Borneo Civil Affairs Unit on the other, over who had jurisdiction in different contexts. They got into all kinds of squabbles about who had jurisdiction. And it's worth noting here that there was considerable overlap between Operation Semut and the British Borneo Civil Affairs Unit, or BBCAU, as it's often called. A number of British officers involved in Operation Semut were employed simultaneously by BBCAU, just to make things even more complicated. And in fact, many soldiers from Operation Semut at the end of the war went on to work for the BBCAU. They stayed in Borneo. This convergence between Operation Semut and BBCAU personnel almost certainly intensified 9th Division's perception of Operation Semut as a British unit and increased the tensions between the two. So fractious did the situation between 9th Division and SOA Operation Semut eventually become that General Wooten issued an order excluding SOA field commanders from any direct access to 9th Division headquarters in Labuan. Instead, they were required to go through an SOA liaison officer. Now, one of the ironies of this is that the vast majority of soldiers who took part in Operation Semut, all of the grunts under these British officers, were in fact Australian, not British. Many of them had themselves served in the AIF, including in 9th Division, before they were seconded to SOA. In addition, many of them were themselves highly critical of SOA, and one of their most potent criticisms was of the unit's British command. Many of them saw their British commanding officers as arrogant, incompetent, and out of touch. And this comes out in personal account after personal account written after the war. But this was lost in the absurdly polarized character of the dispute, as well as in most subsequent discussions of it. Now, the unfortunate outcome of all this was that cooperation between 9th Division and SOA, including Semut parties on the ground, was very poor. This left Semut commanders on the ground in an invidious position. They had recruited locals to the Semut cause on the explicit understanding that those locals would be protected from Japanese reprisals once the Australians invaded. But this promised help and protection was not forthcoming from the invading 9th Division. As a result, inland Dayak communities were left at risk of Japanese retaliation. This risk intensified as Japanese troops began to move inland away from the coastal strip. To escape the invading Australian forces, many Japanese started to move inland. As they did so, risk turned into reality. Some Dayak longhouses were burned down, some Diaxs were killed and some captured, and food was taken, leaving communities at risk of starvation. These are subsistence communities, don't forget. However, even in the face of these reprisals and to the fury of the Semut field commanders, 9th Division stuck to its plan and refused to provide troops on the ground to protect communities located outside the coastal strip. So it was left to the Semut parties themselves, totaling not many more than 100 operatives spread very thinly right across Sarawak, plus their several hundred poorly armed and poorly trained local guerrillas, to attempt to stop these Japanese moves inland. And they were up against potentially thousands of Japanese troops. Now, it's easy to criticize 9th Division for this failure to help protect local communities who had, after all, put themselves at risk by supporting Allied forces. And many writers have done so, have criticised 9th Division, including the SOA official historian. But SOA itself was, in fact, little better in this regard. Semut commanders on the ground begged SOA HQ to provide additional men to help protect vulnerable Dayak communities in the absence of any help from the regular Australian forces. These requests to SOA HQ for assistance were also ignored, just as those to 9th Division had been. This is in spite of the fact that SOA had men available that it could send, and I discussed this at some length in the book. So I think we can see 9th Division HQ and SOA HQ as equally culpable for what happened, for the abandonment of their Dayak allies. This abandonment could well have led to disaster for inland communities, mostly Diaxs. But in fact, their luck was in, or as Diax told me, their spirits were watching over them. For reasons that I don't have time to go into here, most of the Japanese forces that had begun to move inland following the Japanese landings, in fact, turned back before they had advanced very far. And most of them ended up surrendering quite meekly to 9th Division in the coastal strip after the Japanese High Command surrender on 15th of August, 1945. Ultimately, only one of the Japanese columns, the infamous Fujino Tai, continued to press on inland, and it didn't surrender until the end of October. In the interim, it traversed a substantial chunk of eastern Sarawak, preying on a number of Dayak communities and longhouses along the way. It went through Semut 2 and then Semut 1 territory, including burning at least one longhouse to the ground. Now, one of the things that interests me as an anthropologist about this story is the existence of what we might call a cultural gulf between 9th Division and SOA that seems to have made it very difficult for them to cooperate and communicate with one another. And I find myself wondering, we might talk about this afterwards in the discussion, how often this kind of conflict or misunderstanding develops, even today, between conventional and unconventional forces fighting on the same side. It seems not unlikely that in many theatres of war, they find themselves pursuing rather different objectives along exactly the same lines as during Operation Semut. A concern with the strictly military here and now on the conventional side, as opposed to an additional concern with the post-war political situation on the unconventional side. And in such a context, it would be easy for the deep mutual suspicion that we saw during the Borneo campaign to reassert itself. This brings me finally to the whole question of operational success. I'm often asked during talks about Operation Semut whether the operation was successful. As many of you will know, some writers have seen the operation as extremely successful, perhaps the most successful SOA operation after Operation JWIC, which sank a number of Japanese ships in Singapore Harbour in September 1943. Others have argued that Operation Semut was a complete waste of time and effort, with most of the important work in Sarawak being done by 9th Division. My second follow-up book, yes folks, there is a second, explores this question of the operation's military success in some detail. And I'm still working that through, so I don't want to say too much about it here. But one point I do want to make now, as a way of concluding my remarks on the British role in the operation, is that arguments about the success of Operation Semut tend to view success, it seems to me, in a very limited way. They tend to view it in purely military terms. But as I've made clear in this paper, Operation Semut was never exclusively, and perhaps never even primarily, military in character. Its political goals were from the start at least as important as its military goals. If we assess the operation in purely military terms, we miss the point. SOA itself contributed to this confusion about the operation's objectives and the operation's success by its own fixation on kill counts, what are called kill counts, both at the time and later on. At the time, its leaders trumpeted Semut's kill counts, the number of Japanese killed during the operation, as a way of touting SOA's effectiveness within a highly competitive intelligence marketplace. This was a time when a number of different allied intelligence organisations were competing for influence and resources. Semut's kill counts were repeated so regularly at the time by SOA that we might also almost see them, with tongues only very slightly in cheeks, as the equivalent of the modern KPIs, or key performance indicators, that are the despair of many modern bureaucrats. And it's surely no accident that Lieutenant Colonel Courtney, SOA's head of operations in Borneo, later stated that Operation Semut was cost effective, in his words, because of its claimed kill count of around 1,500 Japanese troops. Leaving aside the question of the reliability of Operation Semut's presumed kill counts, and there are good reasons to assume that they were very unreliable, it seems bizarre to assess the success of such a political operation in terms of the numbers of Japanese killed. In these kinds of operations, the number of enemy killed is surely much less important very often than other operational achievements. In addition, the kinds of tactics used are often very different from those used in conventional warfare. In unconventional warfare, such things as guile, rumour, and stealth are equally as important, often more important, than direct military action. And the effectiveness of these tactics cannot often be measured by kill counts. Finally, in Operation Semut's case, the emphasis on kill counts has led commentators to overlook the political successes of the operation. And these were indeed considerable, whether we approve or disapprove of them. So in 1946, Sarawak did indeed become a British Crown colony. While there was widespread opposition from Malays in the territory to this move, Diaxs throughout the territories with whom Operation Semut had worked generally supported a return to British rule. The feared pan-ethnic independence movements had failed to materialise. This was in contrast to Dutch Borneo, where there was strong support among some Dayak groups for independence, leading to extreme volatility in some Dayak areas. Operation Semut won its imperial peace, even if its contribution to the Japanese war remains open to question.